Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Busse. I'm CTO at a company called API Vista, based out of Richmond, Virginia. We are a consulting, systems integration, API development shop. And today I'm here to talk to you about API-first redesign of a legacy application. There's a lot packed into that and some stuff we'll unpack out of that. But first, a quick show of hands here. How many people here remember Delphi? Anybody? All right. How many people, leave your hands up if you worked with Delphi, like you've actually worked. Okay, awesome. Leave your hands up if you're still working with Delphi. All right, I'm leaving my hand up because we actually have a client that is the market leader in their software industry with a Delphi application. So when I talk about in our work, we see a lot of legacy applications. It goes back that far and sometimes even further. So I want to start with first a little bit of definition here. What is API-first design for the context of this talk? And I'm not going to get very dogmatic, really, about any of the concepts in this talk. But I wanted to call this out, right? Because I think we hear these terms, or I encounter these terms, at least in my work, around design-first API approach and contract-first API approach. And I found in working in multiple enterprises that sometimes even these terms can be problematic. In large enterprises, certain words take on a very strong meaning. And if a large enterprise has a design or user experience group and you start to use the word design, they start to lean in a little bit and wonder if maybe you're encroaching in their space. I've also worked with non-technical business users, and when I've said to them contract first, they think, oh, you're the consulting, does this mean we're going to have a change order or a new scope of work? They immediately go to the legal definition of contract rather than something that, as practitioners, we may know of as an Open API Specification, RAML, Swagger, whatever. And we also hear a lot about API-first product design, and I think that goes even a little bit deeper into making something that is truly an API-first product. And so I would ask you just to kind of keep these concepts in mind as I go through this talk. I will touch on different facets of these different things as we go through it, but I'm not going to get particularly dogmatic or deep in any of these. Now, somebody asked me the other evening when I was talking, they asked me about the title of my talk, and they said, all right, are you going to go into like going from SOAP to REST? And I said, no, I'm going to stay a little bit higher level, and I'm going to go back even deeper. And so we're going to go back to 1979 here, and I'm just, to make sure we have cultural context here, we're going to talk about a lemonade stand. And so I'm from the southern United States, and it gets up to, into the hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is around 39 or 40 Celsius, oppressive humidity, and we're out of school for about 3 months. And so kids will get lemons or the packet of powder and sugar and water and set up a stand in their neighborhood, maybe 25 cents, and try to earn money, spare spending money for their summer. And in 1979, a group of programmers created an application called the Lemonade Stand. And this application was used on the Apple II platform and a number of others to teach basic economics, supply and demand, to students in elementary and primary schools. And so I use this as a workshop in API conferences, much like this one, and local meetups. And I saw some patterns emerge, some commonalities every time I would give this workshop. And so in giving this in a talk format for a legacy application, it starts out with a little bit of retrospective and uses this Lemonade Stand as the legacy app we're going to talk about. Now, admittedly, these conferences that I've given it at were usually around REST APIs or APIs. That's what I chose for the workshop here. And so when I start the workshop out, I ask, what is a REST API? And as you can imagine, in a room much like this one, there's a whole a whole range of levels and experiences. There's everything from the person that is new to APIs, as well as the enterprise architect that knows a lot more than I do about REST APIs. So I like to really, really hone in on one concept, or have in this workshop, and that is getting people to think about the resource manipulation through representations. So as I kind of go through this retrospective, just keep in mind that that's really the focus that I'm looking at here. And so now we're going to take the risk of switching to the Lemonade Stand demo. So in the workshop, we actually go in and run in the emulator the Lemonade Stand application here. And so in all of its 40-column low-res graphical glory, it starts out. Welcome to Lemonsville, California. In this small town, you're in charge of running your own lemonade stand. You can compete with as many other people as you wish, but how much profit you make is up to you, and the other stand sales will not affect your business in any way. If you make the most money, you're the winner. Are you starting a new game? Yes or no? And so what we're doing here is we're actually going in and we're using this legacy application to understand how it works in the workshop. So we're going to say yes. How many people will be playing? Now, the reason it asks this question is because if we think back to 1979 or the early 80s in an elementary school, fourth, fifth graders, kids that are 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, they were lucky, fortunate, if they had one computer that was on a cart that rolled around from room to room, and all the kids would gather around it and play this game. For purposes of this, there'll be one player playing. All right, to manage the lemonade stand, you'll need to make these decisions every day. How many glasses of lemonade to make? How many advertising signs to make? The signs are 15 cents each. What price to charge for each glass? You start with $2 in cash because your mother gave you some sugar. Your cost to make lemonade is 2 cents a glass. This may change in the future. Your expenses are the sum of the cost of the lemonade and the cost of the signs. Your profits are the difference between the income from sales and your expenses. The number of glasses you sell each day depends on the price you charge and on the number of advertising signs you use. Keep track of your assets because you can't spend more money than you have. So again, teaching kind of basic business, basic economic concepts here for elementary school, but this is not dissimilar to what we experience when we're working with enterprise applications in real life. So we got a quick weather report there, and we're asked, hey, lemonade stand 1, assets $2, day 1, cost of lemonade is 2 cents. How many glasses do we want to make? So we'll go for 20 glasses. How many advertising signs? Well, if you know like Stranger Things, when they ride their bikes around the neighborhood, we can post up maybe 3 signs on some telephone poles or some trees around the neighborhood. And what price in cents? Now, 1979, we've got to think about, the economy back then, 25 cents was probably expensive, but we'll go with that, and we're not going to change anything. And so now we get the financial report, right? It runs. We understand the glasses sold, cost per glass, and we get our profit and our assets at the end. And so rinse, repeat, right? It goes on to another weather report, and we're asked again. Now, when I do the workshop, I ask people to go through 10 rounds of this and post on the back of their computers the dollar amount that they end with, the asset amount there. So if you're playing along at home or you want to go try this out, $17 is a good amount of money there. So what are the rules? What are the business logic, right? Because when we look at a legacy application, we might not even have the benefit of the source code or maybe not understanding the source code. I don't have any Delphi devs on staff, but the client is using Delphi. And so the rules, as we believe them to be accurate here, are given to the player in the beginning. Now, I read them already, so I won't read them again here. But you understood sort of the parameters about your expenses, the quantities you could choose, the inputs you give, and the business logic that they do give you. So then the next step in the workshop is ask, do we have enough information to redesign this legacy app API first? And of course, everybody wants to keep moving forward, so they say yes. So I said, all right, we're going to break this down into 2 activities here. First, let's just look at the resources we need. Let's spend 5 minutes just thinking about our URL, our URI, the ontology. And I give some examples here of my past in a large financial institution, customers' accounts. Don't think yet about the payloads, request response, the taxonomies. We'll come to that second. Think of it as lemonade stand, and then what? Spend 5 minutes on this. And so people have Post-it notes. I've given them out. They're furiously scribbling. Some groups are just spreading the whole table out. Some people are really thinking it through there. And so when the timer's up, I'll ask, who wants to share? Every time I've given this workshop or a meetup, I get the same response. Somebody gets very excited with handfuls of Post-it notes and gets up and say something to the effect of, I've been an enterprise software architect for 20 years. This is how you need to do it. Boom, 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 boom. And they are laying out this schema. There's things going on. There's arrows. There's boxes. I say, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not talking about like an ERP system here to manage the production of lemonade in multiple factories. We're talking about a kid's game, right? And no, but this is right. This look, I've done this before. This is right. Like, okay. I talked earlier, like approach this with a beginner's mind. No, this is good. Like, okay. And so I'll say, in my I have kind of the imaginary team, right? The teacher's guide here. So I give this example, and I use this as an opportunity to introduce the concept of Open API Spec, obviously the enterprise architect is probably very familiar with that, but there's people that aren't. And I said, in my team, we understood that I have a resource, right? I asked you to focus on, representation of resource, right? So there's lemonade, and I have a quantity that I'm getting, and signs, there's a quantity. And so that's kind of how I thought about organizing these things across these sort of resources or these objects that I saw. We feel good about that. Everybody kind of nods their head, and then generally aligns with what that enterprise architect worked on. Then I say, all right, let's dig in. Let's get down to the field level. Let's talk about our payloads here. And so I give the example again from my enterprise banking past of we're talking about like in a customer account, the first name, the last name. What are we tracking on people? So give everybody 5 minutes and ask for a share out again. And the enterprise architect has doubled down on this, but I'll look around the room, and there's always some people that are not like quite understanding what's going on there because maybe they've come up with a very different answer. And so I'll kind of give my example here as like, all right, well, my group worked on this, and we saw while we were getting the lemonade that as we advanced through the game, there were sort of these turns in the game. So I needed to post to a turn how many cups of lemonade to make that turn, and post to signs, or really how many signs to buy and post up in the neighborhood on that turn. And so we kind of put that out there, and that kind of resonates. And I say, are we sure we're on the right track here? And this is the point where if I'm lucky, somebody in the back will say, well, I have kind of a different answer than what we've been talking about here. And they'll come up maybe with their 1 or 2 Post-it notes. And they'll come up with an answer that is very similar to, what I saw is we have a turn or a day. And that really all those resources, like lemonade and signs, are really just a field level representation within a turn, within a day. Because when I look at the application, when I use the application, I felt that's what we were representing and advancing through. I tend to like that answer. I tend to agree with that answer. Of course, it's a workshop. I don't want to be overly prescriptive, so we just kind of nod and agree that we have some different approaches to that. And the workshop, we go into a little bit more about looking at the source code and some things that weren't apparent when we ran through the demo. But in looking at we were trying to take this legacy application and approach it with an API-first design, what did we learn from this? And I think one of the most important things we learned is we felt that user journey and that experience firsthand. And putting on my product manager hat or UX hat, we got empathy for that customer and what they do and what they go through when they use the application. And one of the things I'll ask is how many people had the road construction crew show up on your street and shut down the street? And then what happened? And many people, they'll look at each other, and 1 or 2 people will raise their hand, because there's actually a very slim chance in the game that a road construction crew will show up and shut down the street. And there's 2 outcomes from that. One is they will either buy all of your lemonade, or nobody will come, regardless of the weather or anything like that. And so this illustrates that there can be edge cases. And so you can imagine a call center, right? There may be this sort of perfect UML diagram and a process flow of how a call center operation is supposed to work. But if you've ever been on the thing where I have to switch to my other system, like I have all these screens I have to go through, like the edge cases in real business when you are talking to real users, while they might sometimes be in the 20%, especially when you're redesigning a legacy application, really need to be taken into account. And so I think I see a lot that API developers or middleware developers are often handed these requirements and often either don't have the drive or aren't given the opportunity by their organizations to go in and actually sit with the users and themselves understand how what they're building impacts the users. And so we can validate this, right? We can look at what is the resilience to change. And so in the workshop, I say, hey, add a cookie, not the browser kind, but you're going to sell cookies in your game now. What changes in your API design? Which approach, the items as resources or by turns, is easier to take this change, to handle this kind of change? And I would argue that add a cookie is just another field where you're tracking the quantity turn over turn or day over day. And so when I sort of look, and one of the things about being in a consultancy is I get to see a lot of use cases. I get to meet a lot of enterprise and talk to a lot of clients. And I see this kind of balance here, right? There's some places where they go database first or data model first, and some places where they go user interface or user experience first. The approach here that we took was very much a user experience first, user journey first approach. I think sometimes when people go database first, That's the kind of thing that will then lead to criticisms of REST, of like, REST is just like CRUD, JSON over HTTP, it's just like SQL queries. And in fact, there's tooling out there that furthers that, where it's like, hey, we can easily turn your SQL database into a set of APIs, and it's just a representation of the schema. Now, I think as software engineers, especially software engineers working with schemas and very tightly and well-defined things, we very much work in an objective space. And when you start to explore user journeys and user experiences, you start to go into a very subjective space. Is that really an edge case? Even though it's an edge case, what is the monetary value of that? It can be harder to prioritize the backlog, and the question often comes up, well, do we really need that right now? Like, do we need to handle that situation? To the point where there's actually an acronym for this. YAGNI, you aren't going to need it. Or YAGNN, you aren't going to need it now. And so this is the kind of thing where I've seen been in hours-long meetings discussing these things, and even seen these things drag out sprint over sprint as we try to prioritize it. If you really put on that user experience approach, the product management hat there, who decides? The customer does by their intent. If you really sometimes just step out of the building and talk to the customer and empathize with what they need and the intent, you can answer that question. So going into this, another thing that we learned, not maybe in the lemonade stand demo there, but when you start to look at legacy applications, is understanding the idea of appropriate abstractions. So if anybody has worked deeply with MuleSoft, you may be familiar with this diagram, which is their three-tier API layer architecture. And kind of the promise here, or the value prop here, is that regardless of what mixture of legacy things, new cloud things like Salesforce, that you have down here, you can write a layer of system APIs and basically expose a layer of abstraction that looks pretty similar, at least kind of similar formats from that. And then on top of that, you can write process APIs that orchestrate things. And on top of that, experience APIs. And in this example, they have experience APIs for different experiences. Could be web, mobile, point of sale, IVR, all of those things. The API product reusable approach might say you try to make one for everything. Sometimes that doesn't work in the real world. But the challenge I've seen with this, and why I call it appropriate abstractions, is I've walked into enterprises where maybe they have no plans to change things under there, and they're only doing one experience up top, but because they followed this methodology, they're writing all three layers, where all three layers may not necessarily be what they need. But what I will say is that thinking in abstractions like this lets you create those resource representations that make REST not CRUD. Thinking about how you're going to abstract away from these systems is very useful there. Conversely, are you just refinancing your technical debt? And it's always very telling when I will use this terminology in a meeting, because some people get like, oh, like refinancing debt, like that's a bad thing. We're just delaying the inevitable. And some people kind of lean in and say, wait a second, there's a way I cannot have to replace that system for another 5 years. And you kind of know how the project is going to go from that point forward, and the client engagement is going to go from that point forward, kind of based off of that concept there. So what if we want to make this, what we're talking about here, a real API product, something that is a standalone, reusable thing that people can show up to and use? Well, what we were talking about there was the user experience, right? Going in and understanding how does the end user of my application experience the downstream effects of the design decisions that I made. And so we're going from that user experience to developer experience. Now, I spend about half of my time, a third to half of my week on any given week, interviewing people for our growing team, sometimes on behalf of the clients. And through courses of talking to several hundred developers over the past few years, I've broken it down that there are 3 kinds of API development. And so I'm using a mean stack example here. We go from database server framework view UI here. And there's the developer that works for themselves. And they're that full stack developer. And they work from the database up through the whole stack. They're working in the Angular and back down through. And through the course of their day, they can make changes and just get things working perfectly and ship a great solution that they were able to build themselves. And then there's sort of a team concept where maybe you're working closely with another team. And so maybe the other team is just front-end designers or front-end developers. They're focused on their work in Angular in this example, and as the middleware back-end team, you're working all the way up and you're giving them just what they need, but they're right next to you or in the Slack channel there, and you can swivel chair and talk about this, right? Very easy to work things out, right? But then the third kind is the the developer who is developing for an external audience. And I think when we talk about API products, sometimes we get hung up on, is this a public API, a product, or a partner API? Sometimes in a large federated enterprise, you might just be going over to another line of business, but those are people you never meet or deal with or necessarily understand. But you're delivering something that is just at the API level. So the lower in the software stack you deliver APIs, and the further away from you that consuming developer is, the more empathy for that developer experience you need to have. And so I relate this back to team building and recruiting, because I think this is very important. So I've gotten it down to one question that I ask when I'm interviewing candidates. Have you built APIs for other developers outside of your organization? And if the answer to this is yes, then they are going to have the empathy, hopefully, some of it at least needed for that developer experience. Maybe they weren't supported in their enterprise or given the budget and the bandwidth to write all the documentation that they want, or stand up the great API management tool that they want, or write the SDKs that they want. But they've been given the opportunity to at least understand the need for that. And your work, if you're going this route, could present to them an opportunity to achieve something that they hadn't before. And so a mentor of mine once said, there's no business problem that can't be solved by good recruiting. And so if we're talking about looking at redesigning something and really in an API-first way and understanding what does it mean, I think a lot of times in these things, they open up a lot of new partnership opportunities, and people say, if I'm going to invest in a redesign of an application that's working, what new value am I going to get? And if you can find those partnership opportunities and find people that can help you with that, you'll get a lot of value out of that. All right, so in summary, right, API developers should actively seek to gain empathy for end users of their systems who are implementing the APIs and design accordingly. There's a great, I think it's a TED talk out there called, Going Into the Gemba. And so Gemba is a lean phrase that talks about getting out of the building, going in and sitting with the people in the call center or the assembly line. And I think all too often, that's slide there. All too often, middleware developers just don't have that opportunity. And I think you need to make time, advocate for time, especially if you're looking at an existing process and you're looking to redesign into it. Let the real needs of the users heavily inform the backlog prioritization. I think a lot of times we get hung up on what ifs or the cool technical thing. But at the end of the day, if you within your team or with your management can't figure it out, get out, call a customer, find somebody who talks with the customer on a day-to-day basis, and find out from them, what does the customer want there? Abstractions can bring freedom, but you need to understand the trade-offs you're making when you're burying your technical debt. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. And lastly, lean in and hire great developers. And what I'll say is one of the best ways to build empathy for customers is to bring more diversity into your development and product teams. And I'm not necessarily advocating that you need to have developers who are a representative demographic of your actual customer. That could potentially be very hard depending on what your customer is. But if you bring in more points of view and more diverse backgrounds and demographics into your teams, I think you'll find that a culture will naturally emerge, if you didn't have that before, of understanding those different points of view and wanting to lean in and gain more empathy for people that are maybe experiencing things in a very different way than you're experiencing them. And I think that will definitely lead to better products, whether it's a legacy API redesign or a brand new API product there. So, thank you.